They say the desert sun is merciless, but it has nothing on the cruelty of a man. For Azalea, the Arizona heat was a gentle caress compared to the icy stare of her husband, Silas Blackwood. On the day he broke her, he didn't use his fists, but a preacher and a new bride. Forced to stand in the dust and watch her own life given to another, she became a ghost in her own town. But destiny has a way of turning tides in the most unexpected ways. Her escape led her not to freedom, but to a man closer to death than life, a wounded outlaw, who with his last breaths would offer her the one thing she thought she'd lost forever, a chance. The town of Redemption, Arizona, was aptly named. It was a place where souls came to be cleansed, or so the founders had claimed. For most, it was just a sun-scorched patch of dirt where lives were lived and lost with the same weary resignation as the changing of the seasons. For Azalea Blackwood, it had become a crucible of suffering. Her life had not always been so. She remembered a time, a distant echo now, when she was Azalea Mayhew, the daughter of a hopeful rancher whose laughter was as wide and open as the plains. That was before the drought, before the sickness took her father, and before Silas Blackwood had come with his hollow promises and iron will acquiring her father's land, and her in a single suffocating transaction. Silas was a man carved from the unforgiving rock of the territory itself. His wealth built on shrewd deals and the quiet ruin of lesser men had made him the undeclared king of redemption. He was handsome in a severe way, with eyes the color of a winter sky that saw everything as either a possession or an obstacle. Azalea, once a vibrant wildflower, had become his most prized and most neglected possession. His cruelty was not always a physical blow, though there had been those in the beginning, delivered in the privacy of their large, silent house. His preferred method was a slow, meticulous erosion of her spirit, a campaign of public humiliation and private neglect that left her feeling like a phantom in her own home. He would parade her at town socials, his hand a possessive brand on her waist, while his words, sweet as honey to the gathered crowd, dripped with private poison, meant only for her. He'd commend her quiet nature, a trait he himself had beaten into her, and smile as the townswomen praised her gentle, compliant demeanor. They didn't see the bruises on her soul, the way her eyes never quite met anyone else's, the permanent tremor in her hands. The final, most audacious act of his cruelty was the one that broke the town's silent complicity. Silas, citing Azalea's failure to produce an heir after 5 years of marriage, had decided to take a second wife. It was not a divorce. He had no intention of relinquishing his claim on the Mayhew lands tied to their union. Instead, he found a corrupt preacher from a neighboring territory and enough legal loopholes paid for in gold to sanction a polygamous marriage, a practice decried in public but often tolerated on the fringes of the law, where power, not principle, was king. His chosen bride was Sarah, the daughter of a struggling merchant. She was barely 17, with wide, cornflower blue eyes and a naivety that made Azalea's heart ache. She was not a villain in this story, but a pawn, just as Azalea had been. The day of the wedding was a spectacle of calculated sadism. Silas did not allow Azalea to hide in the shadows of their home. No, she was to attend. She was to stand in the front pew of the small Redemption Church, a living testament to his power and her own barren failure. He had Martha, their stern housekeeper, and Silas's loyal servant dress her. The dress was a muted grey, the color of ash, a stark contrast to the white lace being prepared for Sarah. The master insists you look dignified. Martha had said, her voice devoid of any emotion as she pulled the corset strings tighter than necessary. Dignified. Azelia felt the word mock her. She was a trophy of a failed marriage being displayed at the celebration of a new one. Walking to the church was a trial of its own. The townsfolk who usually offered her fleeting glances of pity now stared openly. Their whispers were like the hiss of snakes in the dry grass. She saw it all in their eyes, pity-morbid curiosity, and for some, a chilling satisfaction. She was the woman who had everything, the grand house, the wealthy husband, and now she was being publicly supplanted. Her fall was a source of communal entertainment. Inside the church, the air was thick with the scent of desert wildflowers and hypocrisy. Silas stood at the altar, resplendent in a black suit. He looked over at Azelia as she took her place, and a small, triumphant smile touched his lips. It was a look of utter victory. He had not just defeated her, he was erasing her. Then Sarah appeared, a vision in white, her arm linked with her father's. The man, Jonathan Miller, a good man broken by debt, refused to look at Azelia. His shame was a palpable thing, a heavy cloak he wore in the stifling heat. But Sarah, young and oblivious, only had eyes for her handsome, powerful groom. She saw a savior, not the monster Azelia knew. The preacher, a man named Reverend Gideon, began the service. His voice droned on, speaking of union fidelity and fruitfulness. Each word was a sharpened blade that carved another piece from Azelia's soul. She was forced to listen to the vows Silas had once spoken to her, now pledged to another. When he said, "I do," his voice strong and clear, he shot a glance at Azelia. It was a final nail in the coffin of her old life. She held herself together with a fragile, brittle strength. She would not give him the satisfaction of her tears. She focused on a crack in the wooden floor, tracing its path with her eyes, pouring all her agony into that single, jagged line. It felt like a map of her own shattered heart. The service ended. The congregation rose, a murmur of congratulations, sweeping through the church. Silas, his new bride on his arm, walked down the aisle. He paused right beside Azelia's pew. Sarah looked at her, a flicker of confusion in her young eyes, perhaps finally sensing the wrongness of the situation. "Azelia, Silas," said his voice loud enough for all to hear. "I trust you will make Mrs. Blackwood feel welcome in her new home." He didn't call her Mrs. Blackwood. He called the new girl that. In that moment, Azelia was officially unnamed, unmade. She was simply Azelia, a fixture in the house, a relic of a past he was actively rewriting. She could only nod her throat too tight to form words. The crowd began to file out their faces, a gallery of masked emotions. Some of the women, like Mrs. Gable, the mayor's wife, gave her a look of cold disdain. Others, like old Maria from the bakery, had tears in their eyes. But no one spoke to her. No one reached out. To defend Azelia would be to cross Silas Blackwood, and no one in redemption had that kind of courage. She remained in the pew long after the church was empty, the scent of wildflowers now cloying and funereal. The sun streamed through the stained glass window, casting colored patterns on the floor. But all she saw was darkness. The stillness was absolute, broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. That night, the house, her home, was filled with the sounds of celebration. Laughter and music drifted up the stairs to her room. Silas had confined her there, with Martha standing guard outside her door, like a jailer. He was hosting a lavish reception, introducing his new wife, his real wife, to his circle of associates. Azalea sat on her bed, the grey dress still on, and listened to the ghost of her life being celebrated downstairs. The crack she had focused on in the church floor seemed to have followed her, splitting her world in two. There was the life she had lived, and there was whatever came next. Sometime after midnight, the music faded and the last of the guests departed. A heavy silence fell over the house. Azalea knew what was happening in the master bedroom, the room she had been moved out of weeks ago. The thought was a fresh wave of agony. It was in that silence, in that profound and absolute desolation, that a new feeling began to stir within her. It was a tiny, fragile thing, like a seed buried deep in frozen earth. It was a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to feel for years. It was rage. The rage was clean and hot, a fire that burned away the fog of despair. It told her that she was not a ghost. She was not a relic. She was Azalea Mayhew Blackwood, and she was still alive. Silas had taken her name, her home, and her dignity. He could have it all. She would not stay and be his living monument to cruelty. Her eyes fell on the small travel bag, tucked away in the bottom of her wardrobe, a relic from a trip years ago. Her hands, for the first time in a long time, were steady as she pulled it out. She had nothing of value to take. Silas had seen to that, controlling every dollar. But she didn't need gold. She needed escape. She moved with a newfound stealth, changing into a practical riding skirt and a sturdy blouse. She found a small leather pouch containing a few dollars she had managed to hide away, over the years money from selling some of her mother's old embroidery. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Martha was no longer at her door. Azalea crept down the grand staircase, each step a silent rebellion. The house was dark, smelling of stale wine and wilted flowers. She slipped out the back door into the cool embrace of the desert night. The moon was a sliver of hope in the vast, star-dusted sky. She did not look back. Redemption was behind her. Silas was behind her. The ghost was left behind in that empty room. Ahead lay the unforgiving wilderness, a place of unknown dangers. But for the first time in 5 years, it was a danger of her own choosing. She ran not towards anything certain, but away from a certain hell. And in the heart of the desolate, beautiful and dangerous land, a wounded outlaw lay bleeding his own fate, about to become irrevocably entwined with hers. The desert at night was a different world. The oppressive heat of the day bled out into the cosmos, leaving behind a chill that clung to the thin fabric of Azalea's blouse. The familiar landmarks of redemption, the stark mesas, and the distant jagged line of the Dragoon Mountains were transformed into monstrous silhouettes against a sky so black and brilliant it felt as if she could fall into it. Fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in her stomach. Every rustle of a creosote bush was a snake. Every hoot of an owl was a predator. Every shadow was one of Silas's men. She knew he would come for her, not out of love or even possessiveness, but out of pride. She was his property, and her escape was an act of theft he would not tolerate. His power in redemption was absolute, and he would use it to hunt her down and drag her back just to prove that he could. She walked for what felt like an eternity, her town shoes so ill-suited for the rocky terrain, quickly becoming instruments of torture. The initial fire of her rage had banked, leaving behind a steady, determined warmth that fueled her steps. She had no destination in mind, only a direction away. Away from the roads, away from the telegraph lines, away from any path a posse would likely take. She pushed deeper into the raw, untamed wilderness, praying that the harsh landscape that threatened to kill her would also be her salvation. By the time the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of bruised purple and soft rose, she was utterly spent. Her feet were blistered and bleeding. Her throat was a desert of its own, and her muscles screamed in protest. She found a small overhang of rock and huddled beneath it, shivering as she watched the sun rise, a fiery orb that promised not warmth, but a new kind of torment. The day was worse than the night. The sun was a relentless hammer beating down on her, stealing the moisture from her body and the clarity from her mind. The world shimmered in a heat haze, and the silence was a living thing, broken only by the drone of insects and the pounding of blood in her ears. She had a small canteen of water she'd managed to fill at the well before leaving, but she knew it wouldn't last. She spent the day moving in short, agonizing bursts, resting in the scant shade of a palo verde tree or a cluster of rocks. Twice she thought she heard the distant sound of horses, and she scrambled to hide her heart hammering against her ribs until the silence returned, leaving her more shaken than before. Was it real, or was her mind, frayed by fear and exhaustion, playing tricks on her? By the second night, she was delirious. Her careful rationing of water had failed, and the canteen was empty. Her thoughts became a tangled mess of past and present. She saw Silas's triumphant smile, Sarah's innocent face, her father's kind eyes. She stumbled her body, no longer obeying her will, and fell to her knees. The sharp pain of a rock cutting her skin barely registered. This is it, she thought, a strange sense of calm washing over her. This is where I die. At least it is my own death here under the stars, not in that silent, suffocating house. She lay there, her cheek pressed against the cool, sandy earth, and prepared to let go. But as she closed her eyes, a sound broke through the haze of her delirium. It was faint, a weak, rhythmic sound. A groan. Her eyes snapped open. It wasn't an animal. It was human. With a final desperate surge of adrenaline, she pushed herself up. She stumbled towards the sound, which led her to a narrow, almost invisible opening in a rock face. It was a fissure, a crack in the earth hidden by overgrown mesquite. The groans were louder now, coming from within. Hesitantly, she pushed aside the branches and peered into the darkness. A narrow, steep path led down into a small, hidden canyon, a secret scar in the landscape. And there at the bottom lay a man. He was sprawled on his back, a dark stain spreading across his shirt and the ground beneath him. A horse, a magnificent black stallion with a white blaze, stood nearby, its reins trailing on the ground, nudging the man's shoulder with its nose as if trying to wake him. Azelia's first instinct was to flee. A man alone and wounded in the middle of nowhere was a danger of the highest order. He was likely an outlaw, a bandit, or worse. But the sound of his pained breathing, the sheer vulnerability of his position, held her rooted to the spot. She had just escaped one monster. She had no desire to run into the arms of another. But to leave him here to die, that felt like a cruelty she could not commit. It was the kind of thing Silas would do. Slowly, cautiously, she made her way down the treacherous path. The horse snorted at her approach, its ears swiveling, but it didn't bolt. As she got closer, she could see the man more clearly. He was young, perhaps not much older than her, with a face that might have been handsome if it weren't pale with pain and grimed with dirt and blood. His dark hair was matted, and a rough stubble covered his jaw. His right hand was still clenched around the butt of a pistol in his holster. His wound was in his side, a ragged, bloody tear in his shirt. It looked like a gunshot. He was burning with fever. She could feel the heat radiating from him, even from a few feet away. "Hello," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. His eyes flickered open. They were a startlingly clear shade of green, but clouded with the pain and disorientation. They struggled to focus on her. "Angel," he rasped, his voice rough and broken. "Did they send an angel to finish the job?" "I'm not an angel," she said, taking another hesitant step closer. "You're hurt." A bitter, humorless smile touched his lips. "You have a keen eye, ma'am." He coughed a racking, painful sound that made him clutch his side and groan. "Water." His canteen was on his saddle, and to her immense relief, it was still half full. She unhooked it, her hands shaking, and knelt beside him. She gently lifted his head, her ingrained instinct to care overriding her fear. He drank greedily, the water spilling down his chin. "Who are you?" he managed, his eyes searching her face. "My name is Azalea." "Azalea," he repeated the name, a soft sigh. He looked around the small canyon, then back at her. "You alone?" She nodded. "Then you're either very brave or very foolish to be out here by yourself." His gaze sharpened slightly. "Which is it?" "I don't know," she answered honestly. "Maybe both." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze taking in her torn clothes, her blistered feet, the desperate look in her eyes. He seemed to come to some kind of conclusion. "There's a posse." "On my trail," he said, each word an effort. "They'll be scouring this whole territory. You shouldn't be here. You need to go. And leave you to die." It would be the smart play, he breathed. Azalea looked at the man, a nameless outlaw, and then she thought of redemption of Silas's cold eyes and the town that had turned its back on her. Here in this hidden canyon with a dying stranger, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. She had been powerless for so long, a passive victim of another's will. Now she had a choice. She could save a life. "I'm not very smart, then," she said, softly. "I need to see to that wound." His protest was weak. He was fading fast. With a deep breath, she knew what she had to do. Tearing a strip from the hem of her petticoat, she gently pushed aside his torn shirt. The wound was worse than she feared. It was inflamed and angry, the edges crusted with dried blood. It needed to be cleaned and dressed, but more than that, she suspected the bullet was still inside. That was a task far beyond her meager skills. All she could do was clean it. She used the last of the water from his canteen and her makeshift bandage to gently wipe away the grime. He hissed in pain but didn't pull away. As she worked, she felt something hard beneath his belt. Reaching carefully, she pulled out a small, heavy leather pouch. It clinked with the unmistakable sound of coins, a lot of them. Her eyes then fell on a folded, crinkled paper sticking out of his saddlebag. A wanted poster. Her blood ran cold as she picked it up. The sketch was crude but unmistakable. It was him. The name printed in bold letters was Jackson Jack Kane. The bounty was $500. Wanted for train robbery. Dead or alive. She was harboring a wanted man. A train robber. The money in the pouch was likely stolen. The posse he'd mentioned was not just a possibility. It was a certainty. They would be hunting him with a ruthless determination. She looked from the poster to the man who had now lapsed back into unconsciousness. Her heart pounded in her chest. The smart thing to do, the safe thing to do, would be to take the horse, take the manu, the money, and run. She could disappear, start a new life somewhere far away. It was a fortune. But then she looked at his face slack with fever, at the vulnerability of his unconscious form. He had warned her away. He had told her to save herself. He hadn't tried to hurt or threaten her. Leaving him would be a death sentence. Taking his money would be a theft. What would that make her? How would she be any different from Silas, who took whatever he wanted without a thought for the human cost? She let out a shuddering breath and carefully folded the wanted poster, tucking it back into the saddlebag. She looked at the money pouch, then pushed it back under his belt. Her choice was made. She would not become a monster to escape one. She would stay. She would help this wounded outlaw, this Jackson Jack Kane. She didn't know if she was saving a good man or a bad one. All she knew was that he was a human being, and she could not leave him to die alone in this desolate canyon. Their fates, for better or for worse, were now intertwined. She had run from a cage only to land in a lion's den, and she had no idea if the lion, when it woke, would devour her or protect her. The days that followed blurred into a tense routine of survival. The hidden canyon became their world, a sanctuary and a prison. Azalea's life narrowed to a singular focus, keeping Jackson Jack Kane alive. The fever was his greatest enemy, a relentless fire that consumed him, leaving him either shivering with chills or slick with sweat, muttering delirious phrases that offered fragmented, disturbing glimpses into his past. She heard names, a woman called Maria, a man named Cole, and places the dusty streets of Laredo, the cold mountains of Colorado. He spoke of betrayal of a smoking gun, of a promise broken. Azalea listened, not out of a desire to pry, but because his voice was the only other human sound in their solitude, a confirmation that she was not entirely alone. Her own needs became secondary. She learned to forage, discovering that the prickly pear cactus, if carefully stripped of its spines, yielded a fleshy, water-rich fruit. She found a small, brackish seep of water, deeper in the canyon enough to sustain them. She used Jack's knife, a formidable tool she handled with clumsy reverence, to cut strips from his spare blanket to create better bandages. The horse, which Jack called Shadow, became her silent confidant. The stallion was intelligent and loyal, accepting her care with a gentle nuzzle. Speaking to the horse kept the madness of the silence at bay. "He's a fighter, isn't he, Shadow?" she would whisper, stroking the horse's powerful neck. "We just have to give him a reason to keep fighting." On the third day, the fever broke. Azalea was dozing her head, resting against a rock, when she was startled awake by his voice, clear and steady, for the first time. "You're still here." Jack was looking at her, his green eyes lucid, the haze of delirium gone. He had pushed himself up into a sitting position, leaning against the canyon wall. He looked weak, his face gaunt, but he was undeniably present. "I told you I wasn't smart," she replied, a weary smile touching her lips. He looked around at the clean bandages on his side, the small pile of cactus fruit the canteen filled with the brackish water. His gaze lingered on her, taking in her exhausted frame, the new determined set of her jaw. Why, he asked, his voice soft. "The money, the horse. You could have been in Mexico by now." "What would I do in Mexico?" she countered. "Other than look over my shoulder for the rest of my life, I've had enough of that." A flicker of understanding passed through his eyes. He didn't press her further. An unspoken truce settled between them. He was a man with a past he didn't speak of, and she was a woman running from a life she couldn't bear to name. Here in this canyon, they were just two people clinging to existence. His recovery was slow, punctuated by bouts of pain and weakness. But with each passing day, his strength returned. He began to talk more, his initial suspicion replaced by a grudging respect. He taught her how to set simple snares, how to find north using the sun, how to listen to the language of the desert. She in turn spoke of things he knew little about, of books and music, of a life that wasn't defined by the speed of your draw or the price on your head. They created a fragile domesticity in their thorny shelter. The danger, however, was never far from their minds. They knew the posse-hunting Jack would not have given up, and Azelia knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that Sidoil would be hunting her. One evening, as they sat by a small, smokeless fire built in a shallow pit, Jack finally breached the subject that lay between them like a loaded gun. "You never told me what you're running from," he said, his voice casual, but his eyes were sharp, watching her reaction. Azelia stared into the flames, the memory of the wedding rising like a bitter bile in her throat. "A man," she said, simply. "My husband." The word hung in the air. Jack's expression hardened. He had seen the shadows in her eyes, the way she sometimes flinched at a sudden movement. He knew the kind of man she must be running from. "He'll be looking for you," Jack stated. It wasn't a question. "He's a powerful man. His name is Silas Blackwood. The town. Redemption. It's his." Jack went still, his body tensing. He looked at her, a strange, intense light in his eyes. Silas Blackwood. He repeated the name, tasting like poison on his tongue. "I know that name." Azelia's heart skipped a beat. How his name is on the charter for the Great Western Railroad. The same railroad whose payroll I liberated, Jack said, with a wry, mirthless smile. "He's not just a small-town king, Azelia. He's a player in a much bigger game. He and his partners, men like Bartholomew Hayes, are swallowing up this territory piece by piece. They use the law when it suits them, and their own men when it doesn't." The world suddenly felt smaller, the web of fate more intricately woven. The man she had fled was connected to the man she had saved. They were on opposite sides of the same dirty war. "The land my father owned, Azelia," whispered the pieces clicking into place. "It had a river, the only reliable water source for miles. The railroad needs that water. Silas didn't marry me for love. He married me for the water rights, and he won't let them go." Jack finished, his voice grim. "Which means he won't let you go. You're a loose end. A legal complication." The reality of her situation crashed down on her with renewed force. She had thought she was running from a cruel husband. She was running from a powerful consortium that would crush anyone who got in its way. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jack looked at her, his expression unreadable. He had his own demons, his own fight. Tying his fate to hers was a complication he didn't need. He could ride away, leave her to fend for herself. It would be the smart play. But as he looked at her, at the quiet strength that had saved his life, at the defiant courage that had led her into this wilderness, he saw a kindred spirit. He saw another soul caught in the gears of the same ruthless machine that had chewed up his own life. "A woman alone is an easy target," he said slowly, thinking aloud. "Every sheriff, every bounty hunter, Every lowlife from here to the border will be looking for a lone woman fitting your description. Silas will see to that. They'll see you as prey." He paused, his gaze locking with hers. "But a man and a wife, that's a different story. People see a family. They see a destination, a purpose. They ask fewer questions." Azelia stared at him, her heart pounding. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Silas Blackwood took your name from you, Jack," said his voice low and intense. "I'm offering you a new one. My name. Jackson Kane is a ghost, a name on a poster. But Mr. and Mrs. Kane heading west to start over. They could be anyone. They could be invisible." The audacity of the proposal left her speechless. To hide from her husband by pretending to be the wife of a wanted man. It was madness. It was a shelter made of thorns, a promise of safety that was wrapped in immense danger. "You would do that," she breathed. "Why? You don't owe me anything." "You stayed," he said simply, as if that explained everything. "You didn't leave me to die in this canyon." Besides, Blackwood and I seem to have a common enemy. Maybe it's time his enemies started working together. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't a promise of forever. It was a practical, desperate alliance, a lie to keep them both alive. He was offering her shelter, and in exchange she offered him cover. It was a bargain struck in the heart of the desert, sealed by the light of a dying fire. "Azelia Kane," she said, testing the name on her tongue. It felt foreign, strange, yet it held a whisper of a power she had never known. It was a name chosen, not imposed. "It has a nice ring to it," Jack said, a rare, genuine smile gracing his lips. The smile transformed his face, chasing away the shadows and revealing the man he might have been in another life. "There's one problem," Azelia said, her practical nature taking over. "Your face is on a wanted poster." The Jack said, his smile turning into a roguish grin as he gestured to his now bearded face. "Is the easy part. A beard, a different hat, and a confident wife on my arm. I'll be a whole new man." For the first time since she'd fled redemption, Azelia felt a flicker of hope that was not born of desperation. It was a dangerous, reckless hope, but it was real. They were no longer just two people running. They were a team. They had a plan. They had a name. They would be Mr. and Mrs. Kane, a fiction they hoped to ride all the way to a new life with the ghosts of Silas Blackwood and the Great Western Railroad thundering at their heels. The journey north was a tightrope walk over a chasm of discovery. Posing as Mr. and Mrs. Kane was a performance that grew more natural with each passing day. Jack, with a full beard and a dusty rancher's hat pulled low, was nearly unrecognizable from the haggard man on the wanted poster. Azelia, for her part, found a strength she never knew she possessed. She learned to meet the inquisitive stares of strangers in dusty way stations and small towns with a calm, steady gaze. Her hand resting naturally on Jack's arm. They were a portrait of weary but hopeful homesteaders, their story of a failed farm in the South and dreams of Oregon, a well-rehearsed and believable fiction. Their biggest fear was the telegraph. News, especially news of a large bounty, traveled faster than a horse. Every town they passed through was a risk. Every sheriff's office, a place they hurried past their shoulders tense. Jack's stolen money was both their salvation and their damnation. It paid for supplies, rooms, and fresh horses, but it was also a ticking clock. Sooner or later, someone would connect the train robbery to the man paying his way with crisp new banknotes. Meanwhile, back in Redemption, Silas Blackwood was a man consumed by a old, simmering fury. Azalea's escape was more than an inconvenience. It was a public challenge to his authority. But it was her potential connection to the stolen railroad payroll that truly alarmed him and his silent partner, the formidable Mr. Bartholomew Hayes. Hayes was not a man who tolerated loose ends, and a runaway wife who might know about his illegal water rights acquisitions was the loosest kind of end. Silas did not trust the local law to be discreet. He needed a specialist. He needed a man who could navigate the shadows, a man for whom the line between law and lawlessness was a profitable blur. He sent a telegram to a man in Tucson, a name spoken in hushed, fearful tones in the back rooms of saloons, Marcus Thorne. Thorne was not a typical bounty hunter. He was a tracker, a reader of men, a predator who enjoyed the hunt more than the kill, though he was ruthlessly efficient at both. He arrived in Redemption, not with a clatter of spurs and a brace of pistols, but quietly dressed in the unassuming garb of a surveyor. He listened more than he spoke, and his pale, colorless eyes seemed to see straight through lies. He didn't start with a posse. He started with Azalea's life. He spoke to Martha the housekeeper, learning of Azalea's quiet desperation. He spoke to the shopkeepers, the stable hands piecing together the ghost of a woman who had finally found the will to flee. He found the tracks leading out of town faint and weeks old, but his genius was in predicting her path, not by where she went, but by where she couldn't go. She would avoid the main roads, the forts, the major towns. She would stick to the wilderness. And then he heard the whispers from the south. Rumors of a train robber, Jackson Kane, who had vanished into thin air around the same time Azalea Blackwood had disappeared. A coincidence, Thorne didn't believe in them. He believed in patterns. He made a quiet inquiry with the railroad and learned something the posters didn't mention. Jackson Kane had a partner in that robbery, a man named Cole Younger, who was captured and was now rotting in Yuma Territorial Prison. Thorne took a detour. His meeting with Cole in the sweltering heat of the prison was brief and brutal. The guards were full to look away. Cole, a man already broken by the system, told Thorne everything he knew for the promise of a slightly less miserable existence. He told him that Jack wasn't a common thief. He was after proof, not money. Proof that Bartholomew Hayes and the railroad were using stolen money and hired guns to systematically drive ranchers off their land. Jack's own family had been a victim years ago. The payroll robbery was simply a means to an end, a way to fund his one-man war and hopefully find the ledger books he believed were transported with the cash. Cole didn't know where Jack was headed, only that he had a fierce personal vendetta against the railroad and the men behind it. Thorne now had his pattern, a vengeful outlaw and a desperate woman. Their paths had likely crossed in the wilderness. They would be moving together, and they would need supplies. He began to trace a new path, not of a lone woman, but of a couple quietly making their way north. Azalea and Jack, blissfully unaware of the phantom hunting them, had found a temporary haven in a small, remote mining town called Silver Creek, nestled high in the mountains. The town was rough and transient, a place where people came to forget their pasts and chase impossible futures. It was the perfect place to disappear for a while, to let the heat die down. They took rooms above the saloon, posing as brother and sister, waiting for their family to join them. The lie was a necessary adjustment. The intimacy of their marriage was becoming too real a line they were both afraid to cross. In the quiet moments, in the shared glances over a meager dinner, a powerful unspoken current flowed between them. Azelia saw in Jack not a killer, but a man of deep conviction, wronged by the world, and fighting back in the only way he knew how. Jack saw in Azelia a resilience and grace he had never encountered, a spirit that had bent but refused to break. The twist came in the form of a travelling doctor, a kindly, bespectacled man named Dr. Alistair Finch. He arrived in Silver Creek to treat a breakout of miner's lung, and his path crossed with Azelia's when she was buying herbs at the general store. They struck up a conversation, and Dr. Finch, a man of intellect and compassion, was charmed by her quiet intelligence. A few days later, Jack, while helping to unload a supply wagon for a few dollars, reopened his wound. It was a minor tear, but it bled freely and threatened infection. Azelia panicked, knew she couldn't treat it alone. Swallowing her fear, she sought out Dr. Finch. The doctor was professional and kind, asking no questions as he followed her up the stairs to their room. But as he cleaned and stitched Jack's wound, he glanced at the old puckered scar tissue surrounding the new cut. "This is a bullet wound," Dr. Finch said, his voice neutral, and it was treated by someone with a gentle but untrained hand. "They saved your life, young man." He looked directly at Azelia. The air in the room grew thick with tension. My husband is prone to accidents," Azelia stammered, falling back into their old lie. "Husband? You told me he was your brother at the store," the doctor replied gently. His eyes filled not with accusation, but with a sad understanding. He packed his bag. "My friends. I have been a doctor on the frontier for 30 years. I know people on the run when I see them. I don't know your story, and I do not want to know. But I will give you some free advice." He paused at the door. There was a man in the saloon asking questions, a quiet man with eyes that don't blink. He was asking about a couple new in town. He mentioned the name Blackwood. The blood drained from Azelia's face. Jack was already on his feet, his hand instinctively going to the pistol hidden under his mattress. "Get out," Dr. Finch said, his voice urgent. "Get out of Silver Creek tonight. Don't take the main road. There's an old logging trail that leads over the northern pass. It's dangerous, but he won't expect it. Go now." With a final sympathetic nod, the doctor was gone. The quiet haven had become a trap. Thorn was here. Silas was closing in. "He knows," Azelia whispered, her voice trembling with terror. "Pack what you can." "We leave in 10 minutes, Jack commanded, his voice a low, urgent growl. He was no longer the gentle teacher or the pretend husband. He was Jackson Kane, the outlaw, the survivor. As they scrambled to gather their meager belongings, Azelia's eyes fell on the small leather pouch Jack kept with him. The money. It was the source of all this. The money Jack. She said, her voice filled with a desperate idea. "We have to leave it." "What, Azelia? That's our only chance." "No." She insisted, her voice gaining strength. "It's how he's tracking us. The money is a trail of breadcrumbs leading straight to you. We leave it. We leave all of it. We take the horses and what we can carry. We become ghosts again." Jack stared at her, then at the pouch. He thought of his war against Hayes, the proof he still hoped to find. Leaving the money meant giving up, admitting defeat. But then he looked at Azelia's face, at the terror mixed with a fierce, defiant resolve. He was no longer just fighting for his past. He was fighting for her future, for their future. He made a decision. He grabbed the pouch, strode to the window, and threw it onto the roof of the adjacent building. "You're right," he said, turning back to her, a new, almost reckless light in his eyes. "Let him have the money. He can't buy what matters." They slipped out the back of the saloon into the cold mountain night. As they led their horses down a dark alleyway towards the edge of town, they saw him, Marcus Thorne. He was standing in the street, illuminated by the light from a saloon window, speaking to the local sheriff. His pale eyes scanned the street, and for a terrifying second, Azelia thought he looked right at them. They froze in the shadows, their hearts pounding in unison. Then Thorne turned and walked back into the saloon. The moment was broken. They fled, urging their horses into a silent run, leaving the lights of Silver Creek behind them as they plunged into the darkness of the logging trail and an uncertain future. They were penniless and hunted, but they were free, and they were together. The logging trail was a nightmare, a treacherous memory of a path clinging to the mountainside. Traveling by a sliver moon, they pushed onward, the high-altitude air growing thin and cold. The fiction of Mr. and Mrs. Kane dissolved in the face of stark survival. The money was gone. Supplies were dwindling, and they were stripped down to what they truly were, a man and a woman, running for their lives, bound by a raw, undeniable connection, forged in shared adversity. For 2 days, they rode to the brink of collapse. Azelia discovered a wellspring of endurance she never knew she possessed. The pampered wife was a distant memory, replaced by a woman who could sleep on the frozen ground and read the terrain. Jack's quiet admiration was a constant, silent presence. On the 3rd day, they descended into a sheltered valley, a paradise of quaking aspens and a clear, cold river. Here they allowed themselves and their exhausted horses a day of rest. The reprieve was short-lived. As dusk settled, Jack's stallion. Shadow grew restless, his gaze fixed on the ridge they had just crossed. "Someone's coming," Jack said, his voice flat as he grabbed his rifle. Soon, 2 riders appeared, silhouetted against the dying light. Even at a distance, Azelia recognized the imperious posture of the man in the lead. It was Silas. Beside him, lean and still, could only be Marcus Thorne. The valley was a natural trap. Azelia, Jack said urgently, "Take your horse. Ride down the river to hide your tracks. Find a town. Start over." "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I'm not leaving you. I'm not running anymore. He came for me, Jack. This has always been my fight." A flicker of fierce pride shone in his eyes. "All right, but you do exactly as I say." He pointed to a dense thicket of aspen. "Get in there, stay hidden, and stay down." She scrambled into the thicket, heart pounding as Jack led the horses out of sight. He then walked into the center of the meadow, rifle in hand, and waited. Silas and Thorne rode down, stopping 50 yards away. "That's far enough," Blackwood Jack called out. "Kane," Silas sneered. "I should have known my whore would find her way to gutter trash like you." "She's not your anything," Jack retorted calmly. "Where is she?" Silas demanded. "Gone." "You're too late," Marcus Thorne spoke, his voice dry as dust. "He's lying. The horses are fresh. She's here." His pale eyes scanned the valley floor, seeming to linger on the very thicket where Azelia hid. "Azelia," Silas bellowed. "Come out, you foolish girl. Your adventure is over. You will come home and learn the meaning of obedience." The silence was deafening. The old, frightened part of Azelia wanted to surrender, but the new woman nurtured by Jack's strength held her fast. "Thorn, find her," Silas commanded. "I'll deal with this scum." As Thorn dismounted, Silas raised his pistol. But Jack was faster. He dropped to one knee and fired not at Silas, but at the ground before his horse. The animal reared, throwing Silas in an undignified heap. Thorn immediately changed targets, firing at Jack, who dived for cover. The battle was joined. From her hiding place, Azalea watched in terror. Then she saw Silas, his pistol retrieved, creeping through the trees to flank Jack. He was going to shoot him in the back. Without thinking, Azalea burst from the thicket. "Jack, behind you!" she screamed. Her shout distracted Silas for a crucial second. He turned towards her voice, his face contorted in rage. It was the only opening Jack needed. He spun and fired. Silas cried out, clutching his shoulder as his pistol fell from his grasp. In that same moment, Thorn saw his chance. With Jack's attention on Silas, he rose from behind a rock, taking careful aim. Everything slowed. Azalea saw the cold certainty in Thorn's eyes, and knew Jack was exposed. She did the only thing she could. She ran, screaming Jack's name, straight into Thorn's line of sight. It was a desperate, suicidal act. Thorn hesitated, his professional calm broken. He had been hired to find a woman, not gun down an unarmed one. That hesitation was his undoing. Jack, alerted by Azalea's scream, saw the danger and fired his last shot. Thorn crumpled to the ground and lay still. An eerie silence fell, broken only by Silas's pained moans. Jack ran to Azalea, grabbing her shoulders, his face a mixture of terror and relief. "Are you crazy? He could have killed you." "He was going to kill you," she replied breathlessly. The confrontation was over. They had won. They tied the wounded Silas to his horse. "You'll take him to the nearest federal marshal," Jack told her firmly. "Tell them everything. With Thorn gone and Blackwood captured, the other rats will scatter. You'll be safe." "And you?" she asked, her heart sinking. "What about the bounty? What about Jackson Kane?" "Jackson Kane died in this valley," he said, his green eyes intense. He pressed a small, tarnished silver locket into her hand. It was his mother's. "I'm just a man who needs to find a new name. Maybe I'll head to Oregon." The unspoken question hung between them. Her path led back to the world and clearing her name. His led to the shadows. Tears welled in her eyes. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't do this without you." A slow, hopeful smile spread across his face. "Then I guess you'll have to come with me, and make sure I don't get into any more trouble, Mrs. Kane." This time the name felt like a promise. They didn't take Silas to the law. They left him tied up for the authorities to find with a note detailing his crimes. Taking his horse, his supplies, and Thorn's money, they rode north. They were not a desperate outlaw and a runaway wife, but two people who had faced their ghosts and chosen each other. They had shelter not in a canyon or a lie, but in each other. And they had a name, not on a wanted poster or in a church register, but one whispered on the wind, a name that meant freedom, a name that meant home. Azalea's journey from a silenced wife to the master of her own destiny is a testament to the fire that can burn within even the most broken spirits. She and Jack, two souls lost to the cruelties of the world, found more than just shelter in one another. They found redemption not in a town, but in the courage to fight for a life of their own choosing. Their story reminds us that sometimes the family you choose is the one that truly sets you free. If their dramatic escape and fight for freedom moved you, please give this video a thumbs up to let us know. Don't forget to share this incredible story with others who love tales of survival and justice in the Old West. And for more gripping dramas that bring history to life, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an episode.